Our next talk is by Evie Moss. I'll let her introduce herself.
Yes. Hello. Can everyone? Is it all right if I sit here, or is that really annoying? Should I stand up? I was going to do my slides, but good. Okay. Hello. My talk is called "Being Certain, Rational, and Wrong," by me, who is pretending to do the MPhil. I used to go here, I promise. So, I'm going to give you a little introduction first. So, traditionally, we've drawn a distinction between two types of certainty. Most people are familiar with psychological certainty. That's a state of maximum confidence. Some people associate that with Credence 1. And the latter, epistemic certainty, is a little bit less well known, but it's a state of maximum justification. In this talk, I'm going to just set up and evaluate the standard approach to certainty that's had a bit of a resurgence in recent years. And then I'm going to put forward an argument for a new version of certainty called rational certainty. I'm not 100% set on the name, so any name suggestions, welcome. So it's a bit different from both of them. Despite being non-factive, unlike epistemic certainty, it does reflect justification rather than a degree of belief or confidence. And I'm going to argue that by invoking rational certainty, the problems that I raised with the standard account can be remedied, and also room can be made for some internalist-leaning views in the certainty debate. So that's me. That's just the three things I'm going to do. Standard view, problems of the standard view, and then my new theory. I said in the abstract I was going to do more. That was wildly ambitious. So scratch the last bit. Sorry if anyone just came for Morian paradoxes, because they're not going to make appearances. Someone just leaves the room. So here are the two types of certainty just defined. So as I said, the first one, an agent is psychologically certain of a proposition if they have the highest degree of confidence. That doesn't make sense. The highest degree of confidence possible for believing that proposition. And then epistemic certainty, here's an annoying, clunky thing that happens. People tend to talk about propositions being epistemically certain and people being psychologically certain. I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. But yeah, a proposition is epistemically certain if the agent has the highest degree of justification for believing that proposition. As you can see, the first one has no epistemic requirements. So someone might be psychologically certain that the Earth is flat, despite having no epistemic support for this being the case. And obviously with epistemic certainty, there's no psychological requirement on that. So that's just purely an epistemic state. Here's an example of the distinction between agents being psychologically certain and propositions being epistemically certain. So here's a recent topical one. Nicholas Sturgeon, I am certain I have done nothing wrong. Notice it's I am certain. So that's psychological certainty at play. Here's another one. A hotter future is certain. That's a proposition being described as certain. So that's epistemic certainty. Maybe a bit of metaphysical certainty, but we don't care about that. So there is an analogy between belief and knowledge and psychological certainty and epistemic certainty. And just like many have made cases for like knowledge being the norm of belief, there's a consensus in the certainty literature that the same relationship holds between psychological certainty and epistemic certainty. So psychological certainty is like strong belief, and epistemic certainty is like strong knowledge. Here's all the recent literature on certainty, not all of it. Here's the hot stuff. Most of this literature, the ones in stars, have focused on epistemic certainty and motivating it as a norm of assertion to rival knowledge. However, based on how I've described these notions so far, they might seem a little bit hard to come by. But if this is the case, we need to explain why we're often very happy to use these terms and attribute them. Here's an example. So if someone, my friend, claims that either it's or I'm certain that London is the capital of the UK, it seems at best pedantic and at worst just wrong to reply being like, actually it's not certain because we could be brains and bats. Like that's just not right. So I think this is cute, isn't it? I think what's going on is that certainty is context sensitive, and that's pretty much a consensus now. Bob Bedore proposes a model that really just like captures this context sensitivity and like kind of spells it out for us. It basically combines some doxastic logic with some scalar semantics. So those are very technical terms, but I'll explain them in just a moment. It's just to capture the fact that certainty is a quantifier over worlds, but it's also gradable. So the doxastic logic captures the quantifying bit, and the scalar semantics captures the gradability. So here's a quick crash course in the doxastic logic that's relevant. Hintiker, I'm not too sure how to pronounce that, I'll go with that, treats knows and believes as modal operators that quantify over different worlds. And that's just to capture the fact that when we believe something or when we know something, we're kind of ruling out a set of possibilities. When I believe that I'm giving a talk right now, I'm ruling out the possibility that I'm not giving a talk right now. In some sense, that's kind of what's going on. And Hintiker just formalizes this and defines belief in terms of this. So he says, for someone to believe a proposition, P, is just for P to be true in all the worlds consistent with what they believe. Call them B worlds. Same applies for knowledge, but you've got K worlds. And because knowledge asymmetrically entails belief, all B worlds are K worlds, but not vice versa. And that's just because worlds where all my beliefs true, everything I believe is true, are also going to be worlds where everything I know is true, because the true justified beliefs are just a subset of all your beliefs. That's a bit tricky to get your head around. It doesn't matter hugely for what I'm going to say, but I feel like it's quite important background. And this is just a diagram to represent it. So Bedor puts certainty into this framework, basically, where epistemic certainty, so all K worlds are EC worlds, epistemic certainty worlds, and all B worlds are PC worlds, psychological certainty worlds. Yeah, that's that. And also, because the ones on the left are, or your right, I'm not sure, are factive, they contain the actual world. But we'll come back to that in a few slides. Keeping the pin in that, let's do some scalar semantics. I promise it all comes together. Some adjectives are gradable. A line is fairly straight, a wine glass nearly full. And scalar semantics is more than this, but the key thing it does is it associates these adjectives with a particular scale. So you can do straightness on a scale of 0 to 1, where completely straight is, sometimes they call it pos straight, I think. Not too sure. And then certainty is just also one of these gradable adjectives. So we hear this a lot. We'll say, like, I'm almost certain, 90% certain. And because there's two different types of certainty, we get two different sort of scales or functions. So we've got the 0 to 1 confidence scale. I guess we have this with the Creedle scale. We don't really have a 1 for justification scale, but we would sort of make one. So 0 to 1, 1 being maximum justification and 0 being 0. So with this in mind, Bedor sort of pushes these together and says, okay, let's take these functions to be probability functions. And that works really well with the worlds, because you can take the psychological certainty function and just say, okay, an agent is fully psychologically certain if the probability of P, or if it's ranked 1 on the scale of scalar semantics, and that's only true if the proposition is true in all the worlds, all the PC worlds. Same for epistemic certainty. And the reason this is good for context sensitivity is because all you have to do is just conditionalize that probability function to allow for lax context. So let's go back to our example here. The reason this is wrong is because in the context of this, it looks like some sort of like pub quiz or drinks night. Those sort of contexts, we're ruling out brain in vat scenarios. Not exclusively brain in vat scenarios, but the skeptical scenarios. They're just not in the equation. So she is certain, given that these possibilities are being dismissed. That's how certainty is context sensitive. So here are some problems with this standard view of the two types of certainty and them both being context sensitive. So despite being a good model, it fails to account for some epistemic differences between cases like the following. So Ben asserts, I am certain that the Earth is flat. In fact, just for clarification, the Earth is not flat, and Ben has formed this belief on the basis of misinformation online. And then we've got Tabby. She asserts, I'm certain that London is the capital of the UK. Unfortunately, Tabby's quite unlucky. It's not the capital of the UK, and she's the victim of an elaborate geographical hoax. She's formed this belief on the basis of repeated and consistent testimony from authoritative sources. So, according to the model in its current state, there's nothing that sets these two cases apart in terms of certainty. The proposition is false, so it can't be epistemically certain for them. They must just both be merely psychologically certain. Obviously, the clear way to set these two cases apart is in terms of justification. Ben is unjustifiably psychologically certain. It seems like Tabby is justifiably psychologically certain. But this is in tension with the consensus that only epistemic certainty warrants psychological certainty. That was what we got at the start with the belief-knowledge analogy. So at the moment, there's nothing that they can do to distinguish them. This is a bad result. Although some hard-lined externalists might just bite the bullet and say, yep, Tabby is unjustifiably psychologically certain because it's false, and that's what I think. A lot of people don't want to say that, and there's nothing that the certainty standard can offer them, basically. And it's because we're missing something in the analogy. So we've got belief stands for psychological certainty, as knowledge stands for epistemic certainty, but we've not got something for knowledge level justification. There's no term there or concept that's been spelled out. Obviously there exists one, but we've not teased it out yet. That's my point here. We're going to put a pin in that. Bearing that in mind, here's a second related problem, and it's to do with context sensitivity. So the following two premises are jointly inconsistent. So the first one is that a proposition is epistemically certain if and only if P is true in all the contextually relevant EC worlds. And then we've got the factivity of epistemic certainty. So P is epistemically certain for agent A in context C, then P is true. It seems like Tabby satisfies the second part of P1. It seems that the claim London is the capital of the UK is true in all the relevant EC worlds, given that we're ruling things out like being the victim of a geographical hoax. But that means that she's epistemically certain, which means that P is true, but we know P is not true. It's false, because she is the victim of a geographical hoax. This diagram did not render well, but you can get the gist of it. So David Lewis says that the actual world is always relevant. If anyone knows a lot about that, I'd really appreciate a chat either after or in the Q&A, but I'm aware this is his claim. I'm not 100% clear on the argument for this claim beyond just it's convenient for externalists. That's very uncharitable, but it's a genuine question of I'm not sure what's going on there, but it seems like if the actual world is always relevant, we need a little bit more about what makes something contextually relevant beyond the stakes of a situation, because that doesn't explain why the actual world would be relevant. So we need something a little bit more, is what I would say to that. So that's what I mean. So yeah, there's the standards for contextual relevance. The actual world is sitting outside it, but in order for it to be factive, it needs to be in the quantified group. So we can revise this to add in the actual world, and it makes more sense. I'm going to skip this stuff about Gettiarization because we don't need that. Ignore the Gettier stuff. It's not important. Once we've revised it to include the actual world, this is now consistent. Yay. But we kind of have lost sight of defining epistemic certainty in terms of having the highest degree of justification. That's what we started with. It seems like having the highest degree of justification, just simpliciter, could entail that the proposition in question was true. but justification isn't gradable in the same way truth is. Truth kind of isn't gradable. Might be controversial, but don't think it is, at least not in the same way. So once you endorse a context-sensitive view, truth no longer just comes out for free from maximum justification, unless you say there can be no false justified beliefs. But again, many people are not happy with this claim, and you at least need to give them something to work with there. So, 2 problems. Firstly, there's a good case for attributing some sort of state to tabby beyond just unwarranted psychological certainty. And secondly, seems to be a tension between making epistemic certainty context sensitive and also maintaining its factivity. These problems are very related. And I think the state we want to attribute to tabby is just the type of epistemic certainty described in the original version of P1, which is here. Just simply, if P is true in all the relevant worlds. We don't have to add on anything about the actual world or Gettier or whatever. That's just for definition. But as we saw, that doesn't work with epistemic certainty being factive. So I'm saying instead, hey, it's a new type of certainty that I'm going to call rational certainty. And this is, well, it's not the definition of it, but it's a biconditional. So let's get into this new theory. There's a definition. So an agent is rationally certain of a proposition if and only if they have the highest degree of justification for believing it, and if the proposition... no, that's not right. If they have the highest degree of justification for believing it, which is true if and only if P is true in all the contextually relevant EC worlds. You'll notice I'm still talking about EC worlds rather than RC worlds. I'll get to that in just a minute. I think it makes sense to have them be the same worlds, but I'm not 100% sure. So epistemic certainty, I'm changing the definition of and just tacking on and P is true in the actual world. So in this picture, epistemic certainty is sort of the aim of rational certainty. It's like successful rational certainty. Successful in the sense that it's when the external world cooperates nicely. And these are the pictures, the diagrams for both of them. So again, same, both EC worlds. This one is epistemic certainty because it's including the actual world, which is, strictly speaking, contextually relevant. And this is rational certainty. So the reason I am using the same worlds is because of how I'm defining justification. So before talking about justification in context, let's just talk about it sort of simpliciter. Plausibly, this is kind of my view, the only propositions we can have like the highest degree of justification for believing are like tautologies. So I have the maximum justification for believing that 2 + 2 is 4 because if understood and kind of interpreted correctly, there's no way that proposition can turn out to be false on the basis of my evidence. You have to sort of understand the proposition correctly. It's not to say that everyone who just has a tautology told to them has maximum justification for believing it. And because there's no way it can turn out to be false, there's a clear sense in which I shouldn't give any weight to the possibility that it's false. In other words, I should always practically reason on the assumption that it's true, rather than just it's likely to be true or it's not true. So that's how I'm defining justification there. So as you see in this picture, having maximum justification for P does seem to entail that P is true, because there's no way it can turn out to be false. So it's only when context sensitivity comes in that we get this distinction. So let's go to Tabby. Tabby's evidence in support of a proposition seems to just shadow the distant ways that the proposition could be false. They're implicitly taken to be sufficiently unlikely to dismiss. Things like being the victim of a geographical... We're assuming in this case that she's not had like clues from her friends that they're tricking her. Or like she's just, as far as she's concerned, there's nothing to suggest she's the victim of this hoax. And the stakes are low. Maybe it's a pub quiz. The prize is a cheap bottle of wine. No life-threatening punishments for any incorrect answers. So she doesn't need to consider this possibility. So we get the second definition, which is you have the highest degree of justification for believing it in context C if you possess evidence such that you ought to fully rely on P if there's no contextually relevant way that P can turn out to be false. So the only difference is it's just rather than there being no ways P can be false, there's no contextually relevant ways that P can be false. Yeah, that's what I'm going for. Here's a concern, just to sort of almost close on. There's a question on whether this is really a new type of certainty, whether it's maybe just would-be epistemic certainty. I mean, strictly speaking, it is, if you want to use that kind of language. And this might be considered a bit of a favourable interpretation rather than bringing in a whole new concept. But I think there are good reasons to consider it a breed of certainty in its own right. Firstly, on my definition, it's still equated with having the highest degree of justification, which is how epistemic certainty is defined. So I think it's still tied well enough to certainty that it makes sense to call it such. And it also, I think, can explain why some of our attributions of certainty seem epistemic rather than merely psychological. So you'll notice that I talk about rational certainty in terms of people being rationally certain. And I think that's because often when we talk about being certain of something, we're not merely talking about a degree of confidence. We are sometimes claims like I'm certain seem more similar to claims like I know than claims like I believe or I believe strongly. And I think that's because we do sort of slip and slide between talking about epistemic certainty in a factive sense and maybe this type of certainty that we just don't really have the language for. So here's an example. If my flatmate gets home, firstly, I've never done this. I would never leave the door unlocked. I have to get that clear from the start. If my flatmate gets home to find the front door unlocked and confronts me, I may reply in my defence something along the lines of, but I'm certain I locked the door. As I was just saying, obviously on one level, I am kind of being like, hey, I'm so confident I did. I really believe I did. But it's a good defence because it's a communication of my epistemic state. And it's an indication of my justification for believing this. I'm not really trying to tell them how strongly I feel or how strongly I believe. I'm trying to communicate my epistemic position. So I don't know. I'm not against it being called would-be epistemic certainty instead, but it seems just as plausible to refer to epistemic certainty as successful rational certainty. I don't think it hugely hinges, and I think either way, this concept has normative potential, whether or not you call it certainty. But I think it's cooler to call it certainty, and I think there's a good reason to. So, just to wrap up, standard account has two key problems that are very linked. Firstly, it has nothing to offer those who reject the claim that epistemic certainty warrants psychological certainty. Second, the factivity of epistemic certainty is at odds with justification being shifty, context sensitive. Rational certainty can solve these problems, and the bit I didn't have time to say is that it also has promising normative potential. Just to give you a quick walk-in, obviously epistemic certainty rivals knowledge as norms of assertion. This is the certainty version of knowledge level justification. So any advantage epistemic certainty has over knowledge accounts of norms of assertion, rational certainty will have over knowledge level justification norms of assertion. And yeah, that is me.
Eric. Yeah, so thank you. I think there's a lot of promise here. One detail, so this isn't really an objection, is I think a way in which rational certainty and epistemic certainty may, on some views of how we view the context, be different. So say you subscribe to something like Lewis's rules of similarity and stuff, or salience, whatever he calls them. So, if context C1 is relevant and C1 and C2 are saliently similar, then C2 will also be relevant. right? Something like that. What salience is, I think he doesn't ever explain.
Lovely, yeah.
If you think that there are those kinds of constraints on which worlds are contextually relevant, then by adding in the actual world, we won't just get one more world being added to our set of relevant worlds, we'll also get ones that are saliently similar as well. So the set of worlds that are relevant for epistemic certainty are going to be broader not just by the one actual world, supposing that the thing you believe is in fact not true, but also by the other things that get added in by the other rules.
Okay.
So sort of like how, like with kind of holism stuff in philosophy of science, like you've got this theory and you've got this theory, you put them both together and you don't just get the union of the consequences of both individual theories, you get extra consequences you wouldn't have gotten otherwise, where you've got this rule for context relevance and this rule for context relevance, put them together and you get more worlds than just the unions of the two, what they each get you.
Okay.
So I think the two notions will actually, your worry about, oh, it's only would be epistemic certainty, I think you maybe don't have to be so worried if you've got the kind of view of context that I'm suggesting some might.
So I'll be honest, I'm not very read up on the salience stuff, so I would have to read more about that to get into the nitty gritty. But are you thinking something like how they wouldn't be quantifying over the same world? So like you've got, at the moment I was just using EC worlds for both, but I've always had a sort of like feeling that it really should be like rational certainty worlds rather than just it feels very wrong to quantify over epistemic certainty worlds when it's rational certainty at play. I just kind of haven't cracked like how to like conceptualize these worlds, and I think it's something I need to basically do some reading pretty much and figure it out. But I agree with you. I'd rather it be the consequence that it wasn't just merely would be epistemic certainty. Although I'm happy to concede that, but anything I can do to make it more just like its own thing would be good. So that is good to hear. Sorry, I feel like I can't really address the earlier stuff as well as I would like to, but I hope that is interesting.
Sweet. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
That's Janice, all right. I guess my question is just like, it's kind of one of the intuitions you bring out about why we need this new thing, is that you want Tabby in that case to be justified, basically, in her belief, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I just think back to like some of the Williamson stuff about knowledge norms and all of that stuff, and like I guess I kind of maybe convinced me that we can just have like an account of excuses. And I just wondered what you thought. You will have thought of this, but I just wondered what the problem with that is, because that did kind of convince me at the time when I read it for some project a while ago, and I was wondering how it applied to it, but yeah. Sure.
So I personally don't like excuses and don't think they work.
What are excuses?
So I'm going to butcher this, but essentially people with more like externalist leanings, people who would defend factive norms of assertion, belief, they've got a problem because it seems often completely reasonable to say something false, despite having a lot of what I would call justification for believing it, but like evidence for believing it. Not even evidence on Williamson's Christ. It seems like Tabby, for example. But if you defend a factive norm of assertion, you have to say that that's an unwarranted assertion. So then they have to say they need an error theory. They need something to say about why it seems so reasonable. So they say, okay, she is unwarranted in asserting it, but she has a great excuse for doing so, which I think is just a bit of a cop-out. But it kind of doesn't matter from my view whether you agree that that excuses are fine or not, because I think either way this debate isn't going away anytime soon, and there are going to be internalists and there are going to be externalists, and I think it's enough just to say that there needs to be something for those people who don't think that like excuses are sufficient. Excuses are an excuse, kind of. I do have my own like kind of views on why excuses don't work. I think basically it's a case of people thinking about norms in different ways. So the people who are defending knowledge norms or epistemic certainty norms, they've got a different idea of what it means to abide by a norm than the people who are defending justification norms. And I think once you get clearer on what you have in mind, or what it means to follow a norm, you realise that you're kind of just talking about different things.
Yeah, I think also it's to do with like a dispute over what justification is, right? Like,
Yes.
Like you're very concerned with maintaining that if I'm fully justified in the sense that I'm doing something fully rational, then that should
Yes.
be in whatever
Yeah.
kind of judgments we're coming away with. Should
I relate justification to practical reasoning.
Yeah.
Although people have knowledge norms for practical reasoning, which I think is quirky. But anyway, yeah, I think either way, it doesn't matter if excuses are great. I think there still needs to be something for those who don't find them plausible, which is enough of a lot of people. Yeah.
Perfect. I'm not missing a finger. No. Am I? Yeah. There we go.
Yeah, related to this last thing. So, clarification. So, yeah, I wanted to ask about this kind of like internalist component of your theory, because I feel like you kind of like mentioned, yeah, these 2 + 2 = 4, and then the externalists have an easy story because they say, oh, that's true, and true is this property of the external world. And what is your maximum state of justification if you are kind of like an internalist?
Yeah. So I think... So, yeah, what I was kind of touching on is I think if we put context sensitivity aside for a moment, it's plausible... No, not just plausible. I think it is the case that having the highest degree of justification, just simpliciter, would entail that the proposition in question is true.
Okay.
I'm not set on that. I'm open to step down from that, but I think because I'm basically thinking justification in terms of kind of defining it in terms of practical reasoning. So I'm thinking you should rely on something if there's no way it can be false. But obviously, I think justification is context sensitive, and I think we should allow for the context changes. And I think in certain contexts, most contexts, it's not just about, oh, it can't be false at all. It's that there's no relevant way it can be false. And when you start talking about relevant ways things can be false, it doesn't entail that P is true, because P could be false because of a reason that you're ruling out, and you're correct to rule it out. So I think, yeah, does that make sense? Does that answer my question kind of? So I think only when context sensitivity is put aside would I be like, yeah, being maximally justified means that P is true. But I tend to think that we can, like, it makes sense to talk about having maximum justification in context, and like it's kind of like the maximum justification that one could have, not in a metaphysical sense, but in like a reasonable sense. Yeah.
And that's where the internalists would...
So externalists, I'm reluctant to like say I am an internalist, because I think they're so underdefined terms like externalism and internalism. But I think, yeah, most externalists would just not swallow the claim that you can be justified, that you can have false justified beliefs, basically. And I think that P being false is just something that, it's a matter of justification. That defeats your justification, kind of. Yeah.
Thanks.
No worries.
Catherine.
I think you kind of just answered my question, but
Okay.
I was also just wondering why not just make psychological certainty about having rational, like add the rational belief caveat.
Okay, yeah. I think I do have something to say to this. I have a feeling it's to do with Jennifer Lackey and selfless assertions. She comes up a lot. I've not thought about this for a while, so it might be a bit rough. But I think, so if we try to change psychological certainty to some form of like justified belief, which I think is something I tried to do first, you have a problem of like, there has to be some sort of like, you have to believe something in order to have warrant to assert it. But Lackey comes up with these counterexamples called selfless assertions, where there seem to be cases where the agent in question lacks belief because they're low in confidence or whatever, but you still want to say they have warrant to assert it and they should assert it and they're justified to assert it. So that's why I went down the route of making it a sort of non-psychological epistemic state, just to allow for the cases where you don't, I don't know, meet the standards for belief. I guess you could sort of wiggle around that by talking about dispositional belief rather than occurrent belief, which is something I've done before, in which case maybe I could do something with psychological certainty, but you're right to bring that up. I think that was something I was toying with at
I've
first.
heard cases where it's like the doctor doesn't believe
Yeah.
that this is going to cure your child, but he has to say it will.
Yeah, well, it's just this. Yeah, there are cases where it just seems like, I think a better version of this isn't really a selfless assertion, but another example of when it seems fair is like the unconfident examinee. So someone who's just like doesn't really have much faith in themselves and is like, oh, like I don't know, like, you know what I'm doing, and that was a really bad impression. Really getting in the mind of a unconfident examinee. But yeah, they don't have enough confidence. But you still want to say that like they should. You do. I mean, yeah, you do have the justification.
Yeah.
You do know it really
Okay.
deep down, and that's kind of an argument for knowledge, for belief not being a standard for knowledge.
Uh-huh.
But anyway, yeah, it seems like there are a few counterexamples like Lackey's and like others that suggest that sometimes you seem to have warrant to assert despite lacking belief or psychological certainty. Yeah.
Cheers. Thanks very much for the talk.
No worries.
Okay, so you want to be able to have justified false beliefs.
Yes.
Okay. So why not a maximally justified false belief?
Good question. This is what I was kind of touching on earlier. I'm not turned off by that idea. I actually do find that quite appealing. I think I'm struggling to sort of define justification in a way that allows for that. I think basically it's potentially just not true that the only propositions you have like maximal justification for believing are tautologies. That's what got me to the point where I was like, okay, maximal justification would entail that P is true, but that was just for me sort of thinking about like, well, what does it mean to have maximum justification? And I couldn't help but get to that answer. But I think this also links back to kind of what Eric was saying about the worlds. I think if we can get us into a situation where like maximal justification does not entail that P is true, the worlds would be different to the epistemic certainty worlds. And it would just be a case of, I think they would just be different. I think I do want to think about that more.
Yeah. Because I mean, if you do give up on that basis, if you do then give up on the factivity of epistemic certainty, then the problem that you pointed out falls away because you don't have the tension with factivity anymore.
Yes, that's true. I think I want to retain epistemic certainty as a factive thing in the picture. I think it sometimes does make sense to attribute certainty in a factive way. I think when you describe something as being certain, like a proposition as being certain, it feels less right to stand by that claim if it transpires that it's false. So it's certain that this table is right here. Turns out we get some weird evidence that it's not, hallucination or lights or something.
But that's if you know it's false, right?
Well, I just mean if I then sort of were to get evidence that it's false, it would seem odd for me to stand by the claim. Oh, but it is certain that it was here. But it feels less odd to say like, oh, but I was certain, I am certain it was there. So I think there is some factive notion of certainty that needs capturing, which is why I'm kind of trying to add something else on. I'm sort of happy for epistemic certainty to be in tension with the factivity of epistemic certainty to be in tension with context sensitivity, because I think rational certainty can come in and save the day, kind of.
Yeah, a quick word on that
Yeah.
tension. So you're epistemically certain if you're maximally justified.
In context.
In a context,
Yeah.
So the context basically.
According to
stumps out
according
all
to
your
those
own
people,
stuff.
yeah, I would say there's
Yeah.
some you need truth as well, but they would involve truth in justification, I suppose.
So how does that work when you bring in gradability? Because if you're like quite certain, does that mean like
Yeah.
you're almost maximally effective?
Yeah,
sorry,
so-
maximally justified?
Yeah.
Because it might be the gradability that's breaking it and causing the problem that you pointed out for epistemic
Yeah.
certainty. Because if it's got to be max justified and it's factive and it's gradable, you're going to bust factivity.
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure. So epistemic certainty. If you're talking about something, a proposition being like 90% epistemically certain, that is not factive. So it's not factive necessarily up until the point of it being fully epistemically certain. But that is always something that's sort of not sat well with me, because you're right, it does sort of seem like a weird like gradability of truth, and so like you get closer and closer to truth, but that's not how truth works. Like it's just kind of an on and off switch, really.
Yeah. You could go Yablo if you wanted, but
Yeah, that's the thing. I was like, I wasn't sure whether to say like truth's not
wouldn't
gradable.
recommend it.
No, I don't think I want to get into that. But yeah, so I've lost my train of thought. Was your concern that maybe there's something fishy about the gradability of epistemic certainty when epistemic certainty is factive?
Or rather that, so you give one diagnosis of why that definition of epistemic certainty gets you this bust up with factivity. And I'm wondering whether or not it could be this tension between requiring maximum factivity and the fact it could be graded, because anytime you're going to have graded epistemic certainty, you're going to lose factivity.
Yeah.
And so then you might get cases where the two aren't matching up.
Okay, I think I see what you mean.
I'll be far more coherent with some wine. And
Yes, I might have to talk to you more about that to get into it.
Solve that
But
problem.
yeah, we could. Is there any more?
Thank you for answering.
No worries.
Perfect. So one last up to mine close for TV.